Hi, this lesson is about terms of trade, chapter 25, form 7, first term content. The learning objectives of this video is to understand index of terms of trade and how it is calculated. Also to understand the factors influencing a country's terms of trade. Next, to understand the impact of changes in a country's terms of trade on export revenue, living standards, and balance of trade. Let us now look at what terms of trade means. Basically, terms of trade measures the relative price of exports compared to the relative price of imports in a country. In other words, it is the ratio between the average export prices and average import prices of a country. The formula to calculate terms of trade is terms of trade index equals to index of export prices over index of import prices into 100. Terms of trade is calculated in the form of an index, or rather a weighted average of prices. So when calculating the index, the key exports or the key imports of a country are given a higher importance, or rather higher weightage in the weighted average calculation. For an example, if 84% of a country's exports are apparels, a change in price of apparels is given more importance when calculating the export price index rather than the other exports of that country. I have often seen students confuse themselves with terms of trade and balance of trade. Let me clarify. Balance of trade is the gap between a country's export of goods and services and a country's import of goods and services. So there we are dealing with the value of goods and services that are being imported and exported. Terms of trade means the comparison of relative import prices and export prices. There we are dealing with the price indexes. Whereas in balance of trade, we are dealing with the total value of goods and services that are being exported and imported. There is a clear difference between these two terms, but since the terminology is somewhat similar, students often used to confuse themselves with these two, but they are two different concepts. Based on the value of the terms of trade index, we can classify it as either an improvement in terms of trade or a deterioration in terms of trade. What do you mean by an improvement in terms of trade? That is when the value of the index has increased. Simply when the export prices increase relative to the import prices. So more money will come into the country through exports because their exports are sold at a higher price in the international market. Deterioration is when the index value is decreasing. That means the value of the exports are reducing relative to the import prices. So more money will flow out of the country to pay for the high valued imports. Let us now consider the factors which affects the terms of trade. One factor which affects terms of trade is the relative inflation rate. That is, if the inflation rate in our country is high compared to the other trading partners, our exports will be expensive since our inflation rate is higher, and this will lead to an increase in the export price index. So ultimately, the terms of trade will improve as we are having a higher export price index. And the opposite will happen if the relative inflation rate is lower in our country compared to the other trading partners. The reason which affects terms of trade is the relative productivity rates. An increase in productivity always reduces cost. That is a fact. So, if our country's productivity increases relative to the other countries, we will be able to produce at a lower cost than our trading partners. So, the price of our exports will be lower. So, when the export prices come down, the export price index will also reduce. Price of our exports that we are supplying to the international market are now lower than before because our costs have reduced due to the increase in productivity. So, when the export price index reduces, it will lead to a deterioration in the terms of trade. Another factor which influences terms of trade is the relative labor cost. An increase in labor cost in our country comparative to the other countries will increase our cost of production. That means we will have to bear a higher cost to produce the goods and services. In order to cover that cost, we will have to sell at a higher price to the international market. That means the price of our exports will increase. This leads to an increase in the export price index as well. So, when the export price index increases, it improves the terms of trade. On the other hand, if the labor cost reduces, what happens is our cost of production reduces and the price of our exports will also reduce. So, when the export price index reduces, the balance of trade will deteriorate. Another factor which affects terms of trade is the exchange rate. If the exchange rate of a country increases, it will lead to an increase in the export price index as well. Also, the prices of the imported goods will also fall, meaning the import price index decreases. So, both of these factors helps to improve the terms of trade in that country. So far in this video we have identified some reasons which changes the terms of trade in a country. Now let us look at the effect of these changes on the country's export revenue and balance of trade. That means how an improvement in the terms of trade or a deterioration in the terms of trade affects the export revenue and the balance of trade in that given country. Usually, the import and export of goods and services are recorded under the balance of trade in the current account of the BOP. So, a change in the terms of trade will affect the balance of trade in the current account. But the strength of this effect will depend on the elasticity of demand for the imports as well as for the exports. That is, how responsive is the demand for the price. When price changes, the reaction will be determined by the price elasticity of demand. Let us now look at an instance where the price elasticity of demand is elastic. That means the percentage change in quantity demanded will be higher than the percentage change in price. Let us look at the example. Earlier, when the price was $40, the quantity demanded was 100,000 units. But when the price increased to $50, the quantity demanded decreased to 70,000 units. So, if we calculate it in the percentage wise, $40 to $50 means a 20% change in price. 100,000 to 70,000 means a 30% change in quantity demanded. So, for a 20% change in price, quantity demanded has responded by 30% change in the number of units. So, that means it has an elastic demand. Let us now look at the effect of an increase in price on the export revenue and balance of trade. We'll use the same example. Earlier, the price was $40 and the quantity demanded was 100,000, which means the export revenue will be 100,000 into 40, which is 4 million. And when the price increased, the new price is $50 and the new quantity is 70,000. So 70,000 into 50, that is 3.5 million. Yeah, it is true, when the price increase, when the export price increase, the terms of trade improves. Yeah, that is fine. But when the price is elastic and when the export prices increase, the export revenue will come down. A reduction in the export revenue is unfavorable to the balance of payment as well, balance of trade rather. Let us now look at an instance where the price has reduced for a price elastic export. Right. We'll take the same example the other way around. The original price is 50 and the quantity is 70,000 and the new price is 40 and the new quantity demanded is 100,000. Right. So, as we have the calculations of the total revenue, there's nothing to calculate again. We will look at the effect. Right. Now, when the price is 50, the quantity was only 70,000. Since the price has come down to 40, quantity demanded has increased to 100,000. So, the export revenue has also increased. When the price is reduced, that means when the export price is reduced, it deteriorates the terms of trade. But in terms of revenue, the revenue has increased. So, an increase in the export revenue is favorable to the balance of trade. Let us now look at what happens when the price is inelastic for an export. That means the percentage change in price is higher than the percentage change in quantity demanded. Again, it is easy if we use an example. Look at the given example. Earlier, the price was 40 and the quantity demanded was 100,000. Right. Now, the price has increased to 50, but the quantity has reduced only up to 90,000. That means, if we take it percentage wise, the percentage change in quantity demanded is only 10%, but the percentage change in price is 20%. So, when the price changes by 20%, quantity demanded has responded only by a change of 10%. So, we will look at the effect on the total revenue, or rather the export revenue. Earlier, when the price was 40, the total export revenue will be 4 million. When the price is 50, the export revenue will be 4.5 million. So, that means when the price increase, rather the export price increase, it improves the terms of trade as well. Since the demand is inelastic, the effect on the export revenue is also favorable. That means when the price has increased, the export revenue has also increased. So, it improves the balance of trade as well. But if the import prices falls, it will improve the terms of trade. And also, since imports are now cheaper, there will be a bigger demand for the imports and the country will have to pay a huge amount to finance the imports. This is unfavorable for the balance of trade. What if the imports are price inelastic? If the price of an inelastic product increases, the quantity demand won't change by a bigger percentage. Meaning, if the price of imports increases, since the demand is inelastic, people will still demand for that product regardless of the price. So what happens is the country will have to pay a higher amount to bring those goods into the country, and that will lead to a deterioration in the balance of trade, and also increase in the price of imports will deteriorate the terms of trade as well. Here is a summary of the things that we have discussed so far. This shows the effect of a price change on terms of trade and the balance of trade as well as the export revenue of a country. Having learnt about the terms of trade in detail, let us now investigate the effect of these changes on the domestic economy. How the domestic economy is affected when the terms of trade changes. We will now investigate about a situation where the terms of trade has improved due to an increase in the export prices. What happens when the export prices increase? We know when the prices increase, exports become less competitive in the foreign market, meaning the demand for our exports will reduce in the international market. When the demand for our exports are lower, the balance of trade will deteriorate because the income gained through exports has now reduced. When the balance of trade deteriorates, it leads to a lower economic growth, lower GDP. So, when the GDP is less, the country will suffer from lower living standards as well. Looking at the side of employment, the firms which used to hire employees earlier will require a lesser number of employees now because their production capacity has now lowered. Due to that reason, there will be a short-term unemployment in the economy until the exports increases their demand. And also when looking at the inflation rate, since there is a lower aggregate demand in the whole economy, the rate of inflation will also reduce in the country. That is a positive point. Earlier, we looked at a situation where the terms of trade has improved due to an increase in the export prices. Now we will look at a situation where the import price index has decreased. What happens when the import prices reduce? When the imports are cheaper, it becomes more competitive in the local market. That means the demand for imports will increase because customers will find those imported products cheaper. So, when the imports increase, the balance of trade deteriorates. As before, when the balance of trade deteriorates, the economic growth will be lowered. And also, when the imports become more competitive in the domestic market, the domestic firms will lose business. The customers will switch from domestic products to imported international products. So the local firms will lose business. And also when they lose business, there will be a increase in the unemployment rate as well. Because when some firms close down, the workers who are working there will lose their jobs. But regardless of all this, there is another positive side of decreased in the import prices. That is, it will benefit the firms who import raw materials for their production. Because now, since the import prices are lower, they can import their raw materials at a lower cost, meaning the entire cost of production will decrease. I hope you got a thorough understanding about terms of trade through this video. So we have come to the end of this video. Thank you for watching. Thank you.